Chapter 18. The Treasure House. It was less a building staring down at them than a facade, a single wall. The facade did not even reach the ceiling, but the intricacy of the carvings, the symmetry of the columns, the balance of metal and glass in the windows, and the artistic fashioning of the lanterns was far more beautiful than any building Gabriella had ever seen. Even in the dusty light, it was magnificent. The light came from a great dome overhead, which was also breathtaking, not just for the size, but for the materials used to build it, glass bricks. Gabriella remembered how the sunlight filtered through the river and skylight in Nicomedes' secret workshop. He had also shown a penchant for bringing sunlight underground there, but that skylight was but a mere crack. This feat of engineering shone like the face of the moon. "A fitting place for a treasure house," Mortimer said. They crossed the chamber and started up steps that led to the open doors awaiting them. Just before they crossed the threshold, Mortimer stopped and turned to Adamantus. "You don't believe there are any more traps, do you?" The elk shook his head. "After seeing the stone, I cannot imagine the reason. And these doors are open, I assume, as a sign of welcome." Mortimer smiled, threw his shoulders back, and opened his arms wide. "Welcome from Nicomedes himself." He offered an arm to each Sybil and Libis, who placed their hands daintily in the crooks of his elbows. "Let us go forward and claim our treasure together, the court of the new house of Foyle." Gabriella curled her nails into her palms in frustration as the trio skipped into the chamber beyond the doors. She wished that Adamantus had been wrong and that one final lethal trap awaited them. She envisioned a scimitar sweeping out and separating each at the waist, or a hammer pulping their brains out of their ears. But no such help delivered her, Dameon, and Adamantus from their predicament. The three entered unscathed, and Gabriella could hear gasps and cries of excitement as the sisters discovered the treasures of Nicomedes. The sound of coins pouring onto the floor, accompanied by Mortimer's wild exclamations, echoed in the outer chamber, their voices obscene with greed. Gabriella slumped against the wall. The joyous sounds defeated her. Her sense that she had betrayed Nicomedes was as great as the respect she had developed for the inventor. She did not even want to see the treasure. Instead, she looked back at the way they had entered the treasure house. From where she sat, she could see a narrow doorway barred by an iron gate across the chamber. They had all passed by without noticing it in their rush to find the treasure. Her curiosity got the best of her, and she got up and walked over to the doorway. Gabriella pushed the unlocked gate inward. It opened into a dim passage that made a sharp turn. She could see light beyond the turn that seemed to beckon her. She followed the passage, her footsteps soft and hesitant as she entered a small brightly lit chamber. The stone making up the walls, the floor, the ceiling was sand-colored. The room was lined with small benches above, which were carvings. On the far wall was a stone sarcophagus. It was surprisingly simple and plain. The markings on the sarcophagus were in a language Gabriella could not read, but the characters were somewhat similar to that of the oceanic tongue. She could make out enough to know the name written there: Nicomedes. On either side of the tomb stood black iron candle stands. The candles had melted away into nothingness centuries before, but the etched glass that had held them still remained. Sunlight shot through gaps in the ceiling, reflected off tiny glittering mirrors. It was Nicomedes' last, and to Gabriella, most touching feat of engineering. A tomb with lights that would always shine at his grave. "A simple but elegant tomb for a great man," Adamantus said. Gabriella jumped, only now realizing that the elk and her brother had followed her into the tomb. "How disappointed he would be," Gabriella said. "Don't say that," the elk said. "Seeing stones use ancient and powerful magic, they are said to be bound eternally to the will and a piece of the soul of those who place them. Be sure that not only did the seeing stone let you pass, but Nicomedes did too, even with the knowledge of your companions, which would also have been plain to the seeing stone through your own consciousness." The elk touched his soft nose to her neck. "You pass because you wish to help your people, your family, and your brother. And I imagine Nicomedes wants you to succeed. Don't abandon your quest now. Then he would be unworthy of his trust. It is up to you that some of this treasure is not misused." Gabriella touched the tomb again and let her hand linger. She noticed that the carvings that lined the room at eye level were pictures of Nicomedes' different inventions: aqueducts, navigational equipment on ships, and machinery for moving heavy goods. All were pictured with the people using them, and Gabriella understood what had been most important to Nicomedes: service to others. She thought of all those people on Harkness who did not want the tower to be ceded to the Sevwar. Lost in thought, Gabriella was startled when her brother moved closer to her. His eyes were sunken and tired, his clothes were filthy, and he smelled worse than a pigsty. Gabriella knelt down in front of him. His eyes did not meet hers, but his hand moved upwards to grab Adamantus's fur and twirl it between his fingers. Dameon, you did a wonderful job helping us. You make me very, very happy. He moved his head side to side. Are we going home soon? As soon as possible. Adamantus and I must think of a plan to get us out of here. Stay close to me. Stay away from others. His face registered no response, but his hand balled into a fist in Adamantus's fur. She took his other hand. He did not resist, and the three of them left the tomb and walked towards the entrance of the treasure house. The silhouette of the wyvern circled overhead, visible through the dome. As they moved down the corridor, the light from the glass bricks faded. She still follows us, Gabriella said. Indeed, it might be best to keep our voices down, Adamantus said, just as Mortimer let out another wild yell. That might be impossible for some of our company, Gabriella said. The shadow of the wyvern circled the dome again, as if homing in on Mortimer's voice. The dragon landed next to the dome, looming over it. The dome's glass bricks were too dull and dusty with time to see through clearly, but Gabriella could discern the dragon's head as if she were studying the structure. She knows we are here, the elk said. Can she break through? Doubtful, but we cannot be overconfident. The wyvern raked the roof with her claws, producing a dull scraping that shook the entire hall. The yells of excitement from inside died down briefly, only to be replaced by the mocking sound of Mortimer's voice. Looks like Nicomedes has got the best of you, worm. The mother struck the dome with her tail. The hall reverberated like a drum, but the glass stones held. Amid the chaos, Gabriella entered the treasure house, Adamantus and her brother alongside. The interior itself looked more like a library with dozens of rows of shelves, each filled with wooden and metal chests and boxes. It made sense to Gabriella that Nicomedes would not have left his treasure sitting in a mismatched pile, but instead would have cataloged and shelved it in a practical fashion, just like the tools in his workshop. The extravagance of the treasure was completely hidden, except where Mortimer had yanked down chests and spilled their glittering contents. From the sound of the tumbling jewels in adjacent aisles, it was clear that Sybil and her twin were doing the same. Gabriella walked up to one of the piles of spilled gold that the princesses had already sorted through. She picked up a coin and examined it. It was as shiny and smooth as if it had been minted the day before. She bit it. She had seen bankers do the same down at the wharf, and was surprised to see her own teeth marks left in it. The writing on the coin was foreign to her, and so was the face of the woman on it. The city of the flip side was not. It was the same city in the clouds etched in her whistle. She was distracted by a crash on the glass roof, followed by the dragon's roar. The mother's cry sounded distant and weak through the stones, but the shadow of the wyvern did not appear to be going anywhere. Gabriella looked at Adamantus. We need to get out of here. I agree, the elk said. But first we explore our options. Something was following us through the maze, and it is likely to follow us again. We should avoid that path. There should be another way out. Do you think? I have a hunch. I'll go this way, Adamantus said, ducking down an aisle. Gabriella got up and paced the walls of the round chamber. They were smooth, cut directly into the rock. In a few places, nooks displayed additional treasures. She found ceremonial weapons encrusted with jewels, suits of armor, maps, and even books, which she found much more interesting than some of the treasure. The walls in many of these hollowed-out spaces were decorated with glittering mosaics. As she bent to examine the mosaic, she was startled by a sharp bang. Mortimer had dropped another chest to the floor. The noise agitated the wyvern, who raked the glass again, like a cat reaching into a hole for a mouse just out of her reach. Gabriella continued her inspection of the room. The next alcove was empty of shelves, chests, or glittering treasure. Instead, there were 5 hideous figures of carved stone. They were life-size, as large as full-grown men. 3 of the figures, monsters really, were perched on the back of a dog-like creature, while a fifth watched from the corner. Each of the unnatural figures was a mismatch of body parts from men and animals. They had legs of horses, torsos of men, shells of tortoises. Their faces were a mess of teeth, not unlike a shark's mouth. All this was rendered in convincing detail that made Gabriella reluctant to stand too close. She suddenly realized why all this seemed familiar. She bent down to examine the beast that carried the other figures upon its back. It was Garmer, the dog of the underworld, with his flattened face, rows of menacing teeth, and 4 eye sockets, just as Adamantus' tail had described it. Garmer's 4 eye sockets were empty and filled with crescents of dust. His eyes were in the hands of his tormentors, the Furies, 4 enormous gemstones, each the size of Gabriella's fist. One red, one purple, one yellow, the other green, gleamed in the dim light. "The eyes of Garmer," Adamantus said, suddenly beside her. As if Nicomedes stood just over her shoulder, Gabriella knew she was supposed to take the gems. She had to take the gems. She stepped forward much closer to the monsters than she wanted to be, and lifted the jewels from the stone claws. The names of the Furies were carved into their plinths. Lepus held the red stone, Alcaron, the purple, and Kitab, the yellow. As she touched the jewels, her heart bounced against her ribs. She was reminded of the time she had taken a bone from a sleeping dog, only to have it wake and snap at her. She paused before she took the last gem. It was a green one resting in the hand of Phallic, the leader of the Furies, who stood apart. The sculptor must have had a fascination for the King of the Furies, for Phallic was rendered in such detail that it surpassed the other statues. Phallic's snake head was dark in the shadows, the cobra-like hood fanned out to either side. Gabriella shivered. "We do not have much time," Adamantus reminded her. The gem made a slight grinding noise as the claws gave it up. Gabriella shoved it into her pocket and returned to Adamantus' side. "Let's go." They passed more alcoves lined with books and parchment maps. They moved as quickly as they could, before the sisters or Mortimer took too much interest in what they were doing. On the southeast end of the room, they found a door. Unlike the doors within the maze, this one was easy to pick out. There had been no attempts to hide it. The mechanism to open it, an iron crank, appeared to be simple and obvious as well. "Should I turn it?" Gabriella asked the elk. "I can't see the harm. If anyone had reached this point, Nicomedes would have wanted them to leave with the treasure safely." The crank did not turn easily at first, but once Gabriella had turned it a few times, it spun quickly. There was substantial machinery behind it, Gabriella realized, for she knew she could never move the stone that made up the door. But move it did, sliding across the floor with the sound of a grave being opened. On the other side was a hallway that led to a grassy verge, and they could smell and feel the fresh, crisp autumn air. "Go see where it leads," Adamantus said. "I'll watch Dameon." Gabriella followed the hallway out into the grass, where she saw the Elan docked at the bottom of the slope. A stairway cut into the rock led down the mountainside. Much of it had been covered with soil and vegetation, but in places stairs still showed through. Gabriella kept her head down, lest she be sighted by the mother wyvern. The Tantalon was collapsed in a heap at the crest of the hill, where Sybil and Libis had crashed it. The deck of the ship was crushed inward, and mast fallen over like a tree. Gabriella ran back inside. "The Elan is at the bottom of the hill. If we're quiet, we can reach it without the mother seeing us." She wondered if they could escape on their own. With the jewels in her pockets, if they were worth as much as Adamantus said, they could pay off the Sevwar and Mab Miller. But one of the sisters, Libis, by the way she held her wand with the left hand, came around the corner and saw the door. "You have found a doorway. Excellent work, slave." The sisters had stumbled upon a chest of women's jewelry, for Libis's body was now covered with oversized necklaces, bracelets, and rings, throwing bits of broken light on the walls all around her. "Look at this," Sybil called. Libis shook her wand, goading Gabriella, Adamantus, and Dameon towards Sybil's voice. Layers of clashing jewels jingled around Sybil's neck as well. "Aren't they terrible?" Sybil had discovered the Furies and Garmer. She waved her hand, and shadows of the repulsive statues danced on the walls. "They are," Libis said. The sisters climbed the Furies' backs and swung from their limbs. They shrieked and giggled in fear. "Let's bring them alive," Sybil said in a rush. I think that's a bad idea, Gabriella said, then bit her lip, aware of her impulsiveness. Sybil stood straighter and turned to her sister. Did you hear something, Libis? Nothing but meaningless words from our slave, Libis replied. I shall torture her for her impudence. Indeed, but she has done one useful thing. She has found a doorway to the outside. Indeed, leading where, my sister? Up to the hill to what is left of the Tantalon, but down the hill the Alana waits to be loaded. We will need workers. These will do nicely. She gestured towards the statues. I agree with Gabriella, Adamantus said, that there can be no guarantee that these creatures will behave and be obedient to your commands. Nonsense, Sybil said. I grow tired of your impudence. With a flick of her wand, she fired a bolt of light at Adamantus. The blast sent him careening across the aisle. He remained on the floor, dazed and sprawled, like a newborn elk. His eyes were unfocused. His wound had reopened and left a bloody swath across the floor. Dameon made a terrible growl and lunged for Sybil. Her jewels jangled loudly and his fist landed on them. Sybil stumbled backward and tripped over Garmur. Gabriella collared her brother. Sybil leapt up and aimed her wand at both of them, stopping when she saw that Dameon had turned on Gabriella and was beating her. Dameon, stop! Gabriella cried, her head throbbing from where Dameon had struck her. She was able to grab and hold his arms until he stopped flailing. Then she released him. Isn't it wonderful that we get along so much better than those two? Sybil said to her twin. Without a doubt, Libis said. Dameon left Gabriella for Adamantus. She was surprised by his concern and followed him to the fallen elk. Touch his face, Dameon, she said. See if he wakes. She watched as Dameon, with tenderness she had never seen him use, touched Adamantus's nose. Usually, when he touched anything, it was to examine it, but Gabriella could see Dameon trying to imitate her mother's tender words when waking them in the morning. Rise and shine, he said. Rise and shine. Adamantus opened his eyes, but they were wide and unfocused. I fear they did not heed my warning, he said, looking back towards the alcove. The sisters waved their wands, bathing the statues in a blue-green light. The figures shuddered, and dust fell from their odd bodies. The light of the wands turned dark red, like hot iron glowing in a forge, and in that bloody glow, the Fury stood erect and came to life, and Garmur, the blind dog of the underworld, stumbled forward.